Alright, I want to give my bit on the Android OS, specifically in relation to models presented, whether it's business developer, you name it, perhaps similarities or differences between Android and the iPhone OS. Out of the gate, you predominantly have two sets of arguments. One side that usually argues against the iPhone OS and the very closed environment, and the proponents of Android and saying, hey, it's a very open environment. Then you also have arguments stating, well, Android is fragmented in that the closed environment is a very good and beneficial thing for consumers, and a closed environment is better for developers, and look at the pains that a fragmented environment would go through. So these are some of the arguments that are going around. For me, and the points that I want to bring up in relation to many of those arguments, is that for much of it there is no wrong or right answer, specifically when it's in context to a business model. Apple and Google have two very different methods of how they're going to push their, well, in the case of Apple, their phone packaged with their software, and Android in the way it can control its software, and with its partnerships, OEMs out there, whether they're in carriers. So let's talk about one of the biggest arguments, which is Android being fragmented. What does that really mean? And is it a bad thing? Well, one, I would say Android doesn't represent a true fragmented example. You could say that there are fragmentation examples within Linux desktop distributions. But I would have to say that for true fragmentation, there would have to be a massive break between older generations and newer generations coming up. In other words, I would expect older APIs to hold true up to the newer generations. But of course, things being new, backwards compatibility does not necessarily denote fragmentation. More or less, it denotes legacy. Nonetheless, the arguments presented are that, well, three dominant flavors of Android, which is 1.5, 1.6, and 2.1. And now the newest version is about ready to be released to 2.2. A lot of the arguments are, well, look how seamless the iPhone is. There's this continuum, if you will, where developers don't have to worry about versions and things and incompatibility issues, so on and so forth. Well, we have to dig in to actually find out what is the actual inconvenience, if we're going to talk about it from a consumer and a developer, and then of course the companies that manage the whole thing. So from this point on, what many would consider fragmentation, I consider legacy. In that, and you could attribute it to fault of Google, is that they release versions extraordinarily rapidly. For example, 1.5, it was released, spring 2009. 1.6 was released fall 2009. 2.0 was released December 2009. And then 2.1 was released, early 2010. That's an extremely rapid deployment of an operating system versions compared to Apple, which pretty consistently had it go from year to year to year. For Google's extremely, extremely rapid, and thus it creates legacy. Now, there's a huge difference in how these models are governed. Obviously, Apple builds the hardware and the software and controls the ecosystem. Android runs under an Apache license. And basically, carriers and phone manufacturers can pick and choose what they want. And then they can take Android and add extreme customization to it to make it their own flavor. You could make this point analogous to Well, we'd want Google to standardize things and be at the pace of Google, and then Google waiting perhaps for the carriers to catch up to the place where they want, so thus it could lead to a slowdown of software innovation. And that would be analogous to a video where I had spoken about standards, open standards, in that, well, if you do have a common ground, a common denominator that Steve Jobs himself ridiculed in another type of context for third-party compilers, but then went into, well, it's okay as far as open standards are concerned. Well, if Google slows down for the carriers, you have a bland standard. Now, some would argue that's good. But like I said in my other video, open standard versus specialization. If the argument is that we want to make it feature-rich, it's exactly what carriers do, like Motorola, working together, whether it's Verizon or Sprint, wanting specific features to brand them and then give them such a unique flavor and very powerful to their advantage, is exactly that. It's building upon and making rich feature sets to what their rule sets are. But that's not necessarily Android's rule set. Android's simply out there. And many like to ridicule Android and say, well, be more like Apple. Well, Apple has their model. It's successful so far, but there's nothing to say that the way Android manages itself is any less successful. Essentially, the legacy that exists is at the pace of which the carriers and phone manufacturers choose to upgrade their software to. There's nothing to stop a carrier from saying, I want to have Android 1.5 or 1.6, so on and so forth. Many of them spend a lot of money in their own developers making their own unique layers, like HTC Sense, for example. And you're going to find many consumers that actually enjoy some of those cool features, the specialization in making of those phones. It certainly gives a consumer a lot more choice. They could select from phones from Motorola to HTC to Samsung to you name it, and then multiple carriers. Do they want a Sprint phone? Do they want a Verizon phone? AT&T, or maybe there's companies out there in Europe that Vodafone or whatever. The amount of choices that exist is plentiful. Really, the whole point of the Nexus 1 was to drive phone manufacturers to start using better hardware, to enunciate really what Android could do. Because obviously the Nexus 1 is not successful in terms of a direct product launch and then selling unlocked phones, but it certainly raised the bar, because Google is deploying an extremely breakneck pace. Of course, on the consumer side, somebody has 1.6 would say, well, man, my friend has a phone that's running 2.1 and I can't seem to do this, and I'd like to have that feature that my friend has, so on and so forth. Well, obviously the carriers are interested in you buying their phones that they subsidize, and of course the phone manufacturers also try to lock in people and attract consumers to buy their products, and thus the more unique that they make the branding and the more layers they put on Android, the more it really becomes their own unique brand. The cool thing is that while Google chooses to use that model and say, hey, we're not going to slow down for phone manufacturers and the cell carriers. We're going to continue to push our software and add features and add features and add features. And it's really up to the hardware side of things to keep up with us. And I wouldn't be surprised if Google maybe in the future attempts to throw another wrench in the pool to try to get hardware moving. Throw in a threat to get hardware manufacturers to keep up. Of course, there's many risks to that as well. So, for legacy, not really fragmentation, the legacy goes away with the next consumer purchase of a phone, or what Google's doing in helping consumers along who maybe are not going to replace their hardware with something new, in creating in its newer version a way to separate parts of its model to be carrier neutral and phone manufacturer neutral. Because currently right now, a lot of it is specialized, and it really is against Android's philosophy to interfere with allowing manufacturers and carriers to have that extreme customization. But the other cool thing is that there are carriers getting off their butts and allowing these upgrades of Androids to come in, like Hero, and I believe Samsung has a couple phones that are going to be going from Android 1.5 to 2.1. So a lot of the legacy is now being brought up to speed. But then it really comes down to a lot of it is based upon features and these customizations to hardware that carriers build into their phones, and then use Android in a manner to enunciate it, just those specific features, and then that's what they market. And maybe they have another phone where they don't lump it all in one, and they take Android and then they use another set of hardware features on that other phone, and then use Android to highly specialize that specific phone, and then they split up consumer choice that way. But in the end, upgrades are in the realm of the carrier and phone manufacturers to comply. So then there's the developer side. A lot of people say, well, this is going to piss off a lot of Google developers. There might be developers out there that it leads to a frustrating situation. But I myself being a developer, and I am working on an Android application, which is an inventory type application. A developer, I can choose to write my program for 1.5, 1.6, and 2.1. But I'm not. I'm going to just keep my application from 2.1 and above. Now, if a developer really chooses to write an app for 1.5, 1.6, and 2.1, there are different ROM sets that these manufacturers use that require different types of testing. And if the developer chooses to do that, then they are going to be in a boat where it requires more testing, per whatever Android to hardware flavor the developer chooses to use as a demographic. But that legacy pool is shrinking as carriers, like I said before, are upgrading their versions. But this gets into the whole feature set argument, because if you're building an application which is dependent on feature sets, then there really is no point in programming for an Android flavor on which hardware has the lack of that feature. You would pretty much only program within the realm and the demographic that these phones and the hardware phones support the features that your application is in tune with. So certainly there are going to be developers that if they choose to do 100% of the Android market, and they somehow want their application, and this application really has no feature-specific attribute associated with it, then chances are they can use just an old API and will run through the Android system all the way up to 2.1 if it's not really using something that specific to the ROM or feature set. But nonetheless, certainly it cannot be ignored that there will be some issues with it. But it's not really a catastrophic problem that's really the Achilles heel of Android. It's something that's going to, so long as the pace of Google continues, they will always have this tail of legacy goes. But it seems that the carriers are responding fairly fast, that a lot of them are going to 2.1, which would only put them one version behind 2.2 when 2.2 comes out. So then there's the side that, well, it's all peachy on Apple's side. Well, while there are definitely developer issues on the Android when it comes to versions, I would say it also is an issue, which I've argued in my other videos, which I consider a more strenuous issue, in that Apple dictates the tools one uses and languages one uses. It's one thing to say, wow, I can use any programming, I can use a lot of programming tools and languages here and there, but I do have to do more testing. But if I want to do Apple, wow, I can't program in this, which is my favorite IDE, I can't use this language, which is my favorite language, and X, Y, and Z. That also has its pros as well. But if we are going to discuss consumer grievance and developer grievance, it has to be noted that, yeah, while one camp has an issue of saying, if you choose to program for 100% every hardware feature out there, then yes, you're going to have to do a little bit more testing. And on the other side of the camp saying, well, the language you like to use, we're not allowing. And the cross-compiler you like to use, we're not allowing. And any IDE that does its own compiling, no, not going to be allowed. But there is something of interest too. Apple, if people still want to use that word fragmentation, has its own flavor of fragmentation, really legacy, in that there were very clear feature sets in applications that were 3GS specific. And now there is going to be OS 4 features that are specific. And Apple developers will have, as they had with the 3GS to 3G, the same conundrums of, well, wow, I want to program my app, but on the 3G side, because it's only supported 3GS on up, I can't have this type of push features or polling features, or I can't run this background service. Man, that means I got to write a lot more code. And how many 3G users are out there, and demographics and this and that? They could really choose to do the same thing as an Android developer, saying, well, I'm just going to program for the 3GS on above, and the other guys need to upgrade and get a new iPhone. Just like an Android developer saying, well, I'm just not going to program for 1.5, 1.6. I'm programming for 2.1, and those users, they just need to get a new phone. The other part of that argument in terms of, well, the Achilles heel of Google being carrier legacy and phone manufacturer legacy, trying to keep up with Google. If you control the whole environment, let's look at the other side of things, because it does come down to features, what features an application adheres to. It took until version 3 of the iPhone just to even have copy and paste, voice dialing, video recording, and version 4 just to have concurrency, task switching. So Apple has always been having complaints as they released iPhones, it doesn't have this feature, and we're going to leave Flash out of this one. Now, they keep those features in line with the software as it goes within iPhone releases, whereas Google has these features, but it's up to the carriers to use that version of Android and build it into their phone. The progression of how Apple addressed features created the jailbreaking community. Actually, the biggest reasons why I originally got the 3G iPhone was the power in using a jailbreaking feature in order to get copy and paste, and a lot of the services that I used the applications for, it was a joy to use. And now I know people say, well, Android gets jailbroken too, but I've clarified that in the video. Jailbreaking of the iPhone, there's two endpoints. One is you jailbreak the iPhone to unlock its SIM card to the carrier. And the other is you attack the software and try to add features and applications that are normally not there or prohibited. The Android jailbreak is not an attack on Android. It's an attack to the carrier, to the phone manufacturer. It's in essence circumventing the specific layers the carriers and phone manufacturers put on, so that they can get full feature use out of the phone. An example is the backflip from AT&T, which prohibits any other third-party application, which is an AT&T lock, not an Android lock. See, people want to blame Android. Android's out there. It's like this specification. It's open to be used. It's like this Apache license operating system out there to be used that carriers can take and mold and highly customize and really do what they want. And so a jailbreak of Android is attacking the carrier-specific software. So let's say a consumer doesn't like the AT&T restriction. They're going to jailbreak the AT&T part of it and thus get full use out of the phone. It's a very different thing than physically going after the iPhone OS to put in features that normally weren't there, which is the software side of things. Now, I know another large part of the jailbreaking was the whole iTunes Marketplace control. And I think that's a whole other video in itself in terms of application marketplaces and applications being allowed and what applications aren't being allowed. But in the end, really, consumers are going to complain whether they have an iPhone or an Android phone or a Palm Pre, because I myself own an iPhone and a Palm Pre Plus, and I enjoy both of them. But you're always going to hear people complaining about the lack of features of the iPhone, or how slow it is, or people complaining about Android. Oh, I have 1.6 and I wish I could have 2.2, so on and so forth. Both models have their pros and cons, and there's no halo over either model. And certainly the same goes, really, on the developer side of things. But I think it should be cleared that to really use the word fragmentation should best be used when there is truly a fracture and a break. Like older APIs just simply won't work. Version 1 is version 1 exclusive. There is no going from version 1 to 1.5 or like a 1.7. And 1.7 is exclusive to itself and no other. There's no other way around it. You're stuck in 1.7. Perhaps you're in a 2.2 over here. And then that world is just exclusive to itself in 2.2, and no applications can bleed in or out of that or what have you. So I know that I'm repeating myself. It should be clear that what Android is creating is legacy because of their rapid deployment with as close of a time span as 2 to 3 months in releasing operating system versions. And even going at the pace of Apple at once a year, perhaps consumers don't buy iPhones at the pace that Apple would like their feature sets to be absorbed by the consumer base, background services and things, and some of the features that the 3GS had. It's just the nature of the beast. So anyway, that was my bit. Thanks for watching.